Commander Zethkar looked at the datapad with tired eyes. Another assignment, another species to watch and record for the Galactic Observation Corps. His long blue fingers tapped against the metal surface of his desk as he read through the mission. Details. The humans were going to fight the Korthak Empire, and he had to watch it happen. The Veltari commander had done this job for over 200 years. He had watched 17 different species face the Korthak in battle. Every single time, the story was the same. The Korthak would arrive with their sleek black ships and energy weapons. The other species would try to fight back. Within a few hours, maybe a day if they were lucky, it would all be over. The Korthak always won. Zethkar stood up from his chair and walked to the large window of his office. Outside, he could see the stars that held so many different worlds and so many different people. Most of them were peaceful now, part of the Galactic Union where wars were rare and life was safe. But sometimes new species would be discovered, and sometimes those species would meet the Korthak before they could join the Union. The humans were one of those unlucky species. They had only learned to travel between stars 50 years ago. Their ships were big and slow, made from metal instead of the energy fields that most advanced species used. Their weapons were simple projectiles and explosive devices. They had no shields, no plasma cannons, no gravity manipulators. They were like children playing with sticks while facing an army with laser rifles. The mission briefing said the humans had made contact with the Korthak 3 months ago. The Korthak had demanded that humans surrender their home system and become slaves. The humans had said no. Now the Korthak were coming to take what they wanted by force. Zethkar shook his head as he read about human technology. Their fastest ships could barely reach half the speed of Korthak vessels. Their strongest weapons would barely scratch Korthak armor. Their biggest ships carried maybe 1,000 crew members, while Korthak battleships held 10,000 warriors. This was not going to be a battle. This was going to be a massacre. He picked up his communication device and called his team. Dr. Nixara was a psychologist who studied how different species behaved in combat. Lieutenant Kixtor was a technology expert who analyzed weapons and ships. Both of them were good at their jobs, but Zethkar knew this mission would be boring for all of them. They would watch the humans lose quickly, write their report, and move on to the next assignment. The observation ship was already waiting for them at the space dock. It was small and fast, with the best cloaking technology the Union had. No one would be able to see them during the battle. They would be safe, while they watched the humans die. As Zethkar packed his equipment, he thought about the human leader who would command their fleet. The report said his name was Jake Morrison, a captain in something called the United Earth Space Navy. Morrison was young for a fleet commander, only 45 years old. Most species would not trust someone so young with such responsibility, but humans had short lives, so they had to grow up fast. The intelligence files showed that Morrison had fought in several small battles against space pirates and had won most of them. But fighting pirates was very different from fighting the Korthak Empire. Pirates used old ships and poor tactics. The Korthak were professional warriors who had conquered dozens of star systems. Zethkar looked at the pictures of human ships. They had names like Liberty, Defiance, and Endurance. The name sounded brave, but the ships looked fragile. They were made of steel and titanium, materials that would melt under Korthak energy weapons. Their hulls were thick but crude, like armor made by blacksmiths instead of scientists. The human fleet would gather at a place called Kepler 442, a star system with 3 planets that had valuable minerals. The Korthak wanted those minerals, and they would take them. The humans would try to stop them, and they would fail. Zethkar had seen it happen so many times before. He finished packing and headed to the space dock. His team was already there, loading their equipment onto the observation ship. Dr. Nixara looked excited about studying a new species, even though that study would be short. Lieutenant Kixtor was checking his sensors and cameras, making sure they would record everything clearly. The observation ship lifted off and headed toward Kepler 442. It would take them 3 days to reach the system, and the battle would probably start shortly after they arrived. Zethkar settled into his captain's chair and began reading more files about humans. They were an interesting species in some ways. They came from a dangerous world with many predators and natural disasters. They had learned to work together to survive, but they also fought wars among themselves. They had strong emotions and formed deep bonds with each other. They created art and music and stories. They were not evil or stupid, but none of that would matter when the Korthak arrived. Good people died in wars just as easily as bad people. Intelligence and creativity meant nothing when facing superior firepower. Zethkar had learned that lesson many times over his long career. The ship jumped into faster-than-light travel, and the stars outside became long streaks of light. Soon they would reach Kepler 442, and soon Zethkar would watch another species lose their freedom and their lives to the Korthak Empire. The observation ship reached Kepler 442 just as the human fleet was taking position around the third planet. Zethkar watched through his sensors as 37 human vessels spread out in what looked like a defensive formation. The ships were exactly as primitive as the reports had said. Big metal boxes with engines attached, moving slowly through space like wounded animals. Captain Jake Morrison's flagship was easy to spot. The Liberty was the largest ship in the human fleet, but it still looked tiny compared to what was coming. Zethkar had seen the Korthak fleet on his long-range sensors. 42 ships, each one sleek and deadly, racing toward the system at twice the speed the humans could manage. Dr. Nixara was studying the human communications. She could translate most languages quickly, and human speech was not difficult to understand. The voices coming from the human ships were calm and professional, but she could detect fear underneath. The humans knew they were going to face something terrible, but they were trying to stay brave. Lieutenant Kixtor was analyzing the human weapons. Kinetic cannons that fired metal projectiles, nuclear missiles that seemed powerful but slow, and small fighter craft that looked like toys compared to Korthak war machines. He shook his head as he watched the humans prepare for battle. It was like watching farmers with pitchforks getting ready to fight trained soldiers. The Korthak fleet arrived exactly when their computers predicted. 42 black ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. They moved in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with energy shields and weapon arrays. Each ship was a work of art, designed by a species that had been fighting wars for thousands of years. Zethkar expected the humans to surrender immediately. Most species did when they saw Korthak ships for the first time. The black vessels were beautiful and terrifying, making it clear that resistance was hopeless. But the human fleet did not surrender. Instead, Captain Morrison's voice came over the communication channels, clear and steady. "All ships, this is Liberty Actual. Enemy fleet has entered the system. Execute Battle Plan Alpha. Remember what we're fighting for." The human ships began to move, but not in any pattern that Zethkar recognized. Instead of forming a battle line or trying to retreat, they scattered in different directions. Some ships headed toward the asteroid belt, others moved closer to the planet, and a few actually accelerated toward the Korthak fleet. The Korthak commander must have been as confused as Zethkar was, because the enemy ships paused for a moment before opening fire. When they did attack, their energy weapons lit up space like lightning. The first volley destroyed 3 human ships instantly, turning them into clouds of glowing metal and vapor. But something strange happened after that. The humans did not panic or run away. Instead, they seemed to use the destruction of their own ships as a signal to begin their real attack. A cargo vessel called the Endurance, commanded by a woman named Lisa Carter, suddenly changed course and headed straight for a Korthak cruiser. Zethkar watched in disbelief as the Endurance accelerated to ramming speed. The Korthak ship fired at it repeatedly, tearing holes in its hull and setting it on fire, but the human ship kept coming. At the last second, Carter detonated her ship's nuclear reactor. The explosion was so bright that it overloaded Zethkar's sensors for several seconds. When the light faded, the Korthak cruiser was gone. 2 more enemy ships had been damaged by the blast, their shields flickering and their formation broken. The humans had traded 1 cargo ship for 3 military vessels. But that was impossible. Cargo ships were not weapons. They were not supposed to be used as weapons. Dr. Nixara was studying the psychological readings from the human fleet. Her instruments showed stress levels that should have made the humans unable to function, but somehow they were still fighting, with perfect coordination. Fear was flowing through their ships like electricity, but instead of paralyzing them, it seemed to make them more focused. Another human ship, the Defiance under Captain Alex Rodriguez, lost its main engines to Korthak fire. Instead of trying to escape or surrender, Rodriguez ordered his crew to rig the ship as a kinetic weapon. They used their maneuvering thrusters to aim the crippled vessel at a Korthak battleship and fired all their remaining missiles to push it faster. The Defiance hit the enemy ship like a hammer striking glass. The Korthak battleship's shields held for a moment, then collapsed as the massive human vessel punched through its hull. Both ships died in the collision, but the explosion took out a 3rd Korthak ship that had been too close to the impact. Zethkar felt something he had never experienced while watching a battle. Fear. Not fear for himself, because his observation ship was safely hidden, but fear of the humans. They were fighting like no species he had ever seen. They were not trying to win in any normal sense. They were trying to hurt their enemies as much as possible before they died. The battle was supposed to be over in minutes, but it had been going on for an hour. The Korthak still had more ships and better weapons, but they were clearly shaken by human tactics. Their perfect formations were broken. Their ships were keeping more distance from the humans, afraid of being rammed or bombed. A group of human fighter pilots, led by a man named Casey Williams, was attacking a Korthak destroyer. Their small craft should have been swatted down like insects, but they were flying in ways that made no sense. They used debris from destroyed ships as cover, fired their weapons while spinning wildly through space, and seemed to have no fear of death at all. Williams led his squadron straight into the destroyer's weapon arrays, knowing that most of them would die. The Korthak shot down 8 of the 12 fighters, but the survivors managed to damage the destroyer's main guns. As Williams pulled away from the attack, his fighter was hit by enemy fire. Instead of trying to save himself, he turned around and crashed his burning aircraft into the destroyer's bridge. Lieutenant Kixtor was recording everything, but he kept shaking his head in disbelief. The humans were using tactics that no military academy would ever teach. They were turning their weaknesses into strengths and their desperation into weapons. They fought like they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The Korthak commander was clearly frustrated. His ships were still winning, but not in the way they expected. Every human vessel that died took at least 1 Korthak ship with it. The battle was becoming expensive, and the Korthak did not like expensive victories. Zethkar realized that he was watching something new. The humans were not fighting to win. They were fighting to make their enemies regret attacking them. They were fighting to make the cost of victory so high that the Korthak would think twice before attacking another human world. And it was working. 3 hours into the battle, Zethkar was studying the humans more carefully than he had ever studied any species before. His instruments were picking up readings that should have been impossible. The human crews were experiencing levels of stress and fear that would kill most sentient beings, but they continued to fight with incredible skill and coordination. Dr. Nixara was fascinated by what her sensors were showing her. On the bridge of the Liberty, Lieutenant Commander Sam Torres was coordinating fighter squadrons while his heart rate was 3 times normal and his stress hormones were at toxic levels. Any other species would have collapsed or gone insane, but Torres was making tactical decisions with perfect clarity. The human brain seemed to work differently than other species when faced with mortal danger. Instead of shutting down or becoming confused, it seemed to focus more sharply. The humans were not ignoring their fear. They were using it as fuel for their determination. A fighter pilot named Casey Williams was performing maneuvers that violated several laws of physics and common sense. Her small craft was missing its left wing and had fires burning in 3 different compartments, but she was still attacking Korthak ships with deadly precision. Her voice on the communication channels was calm and professional, as if she was conducting a training exercise instead of fighting for her life. Lieutenant Kixtor had been analyzing human technology and tactics for hours, and he was beginning to understand something that scared him. The humans were not just improvising. They had planned to fight this way. Their ships were designed to be used as weapons even after they were crippled. Their crews were trained to keep fighting even when their vessels were falling apart around them. The human ship called Defiance had been boarded by Korthak warriors an hour ago. Most species would surrender when enemy soldiers took control of their vessel, but the human crew, led by Chief Engineer Ben Murphy, was fighting through their own ship room by room. They were using maintenance tools as weapons and turning their knowledge of the ship's systems against the invaders. Zethkar watched as Murphy led his team through the ship's ventilation system to attack the Korthak from behind. The humans were using welding torches as flamethrowers and industrial cutters as swords. They had turned their engineering deck into a maze of traps and ambushes. The Korthak warriors, trained for conventional combat, were being defeated by repair, technicians, and mechanics. The psychological profile of the human species was unlike anything in Zethkar's files. Most intelligent life forms developed technology to make their lives safer and more comfortable. They avoided danger and sought security. But humans seemed to embrace danger as a natural part of existence. They acknowledged that they were fragile and mortal, then chose to act with courage anyway. Dr. Nixara was listening to human communications from across the fleet. The conversations were filled with references to things that had nothing to do with the battle. Crew members talked about their families back on Earth, about children they wanted to see again, about promises they had made to people they loved. The humans were not fighting for abstract military objectives. They were fighting for personal reasons that gave them strength. A weapons officer on the Liberty named Danny Park was operating his gun systems while suffering from radiation poisoning. That should have killed him an hour ago. His hands were shaking and his vision was blurred, but he continued to fire at enemy ships with deadly accuracy. When asked by his captain if he needed medical attention, Park simply said that he would see the doctor after the battle was over. The Korthak Empire had conquered 47 star systems using fear as their primary weapon. Their ships were designed to look intimidating. Their warriors wore armor that made them appear larger and more dangerous, and their tactics were calculated to break enemy morale quickly. But the humans seemed immune to fear-based warfare. They acknowledged that the Korthak were powerful and dangerous, then attacked them anyway. Zethkar realized that he was witnessing something that had never been recorded in galactic history. A species that grew stronger under pressure instead of weaker. The worse the situation became for the humans, the more creative and determined they seemed to get. They were not fighting despite their mortality. They were fighting because of it. The human medical officer on the Liberty, Dr. Helen Cross, was treating wounded crew members while her medical bay was being hit by enemy fire. Pieces of the ceiling were falling around her. The lights were flickering, and alarms were sounding everywhere, but she continued her work with steady hands. She had already saved 12 lives during the battle, and she showed no signs of slowing down. Lieutenant Kixtor had been studying the human ships and their construction. He realized that the vessels were not just built to fight. They were built to keep fighting even after they should have been destroyed. The humans had redundant systems for their redundant systems. When their main weapons failed, they switched to backup weapons. When their backup weapons failed, they used their engines as weapons. When their engines failed, they used their ships themselves as weapons. The battle was now entering its 4th hour, and the Korthak fleet was showing signs of confusion and frustration. Their superior technology was giving them an advantage, but not the quick victory they expected. Every human ship they destroyed took at least one Korthak vessel with it, and sometimes more. The mathematics of the battle were not working in their favor. A human communications officer named Rachel Stone was coordinating fleet movements, while her station was sparking and smoking from enemy hits. She had burns on her arms and a cut on her forehead, but she continued to relay orders between ships with perfect efficiency. When a Korthak energy beam passed so close to her that it singed her hair, she did not even pause in her work. Dr. Nixara made a discovery that chilled her to the bone. The humans were not fighting at their maximum capability. They were holding back, saving their most desperate tactics for when they would be needed most. They had plans within plans, and strategies that would only be used when everything else failed. The battle that Zethkar thought he was watching was only the beginning of what the humans were prepared to do. The observation team was beginning to understand that they were not just watching a military engagement. They were watching a glimpse into the human soul. And what they saw there was both beautiful and terrifying. The humans fought not because they were confident of victory, but because they refused to accept defeat. They knew they might die, but they chose to make their deaths meaningful. Zethkar looked at his instruments and realized that the battle was far from over. The Korthak still had more ships and better weapons, but the humans had something that could not be measured by sensors or calculated by computers. They had the kind of determination that could move mountains or topple empires. 6 hours into what should have been a 20-minute battle, the Korthak commander made a decision that would change everything. Frustrated by the unexpected resistance and heavy losses, he authorized the use of biological weapons against the human fleet. The toxins were designed to kill quickly and efficiently, ending the battle before more Korthak ships could be destroyed. Zethkar watched in horror as green clouds of poison spread from Korthak ships toward the human vessels. Biological weapons were forbidden by galactic law when used against member species of the Union, but humans were not members yet. Technically, the Korthak were not breaking any rules, but they were crossing a line that most civilized species would never cross. The toxins hit the human ships like invisible death. They passed through hull breaches and life support systems, spreading throughout the vessels in minutes. Zethkar expected the human crews to start dying immediately, but what happened next defied all logic and medical science. Dr. Helen Cross, the chief medical officer on the Liberty, detected the biological attack within seconds of its beginning. Instead of panicking or accepting defeat, she immediately began analyzing the toxins while they were killing her crew around her. Her medical bay became a laboratory where she worked to save lives while her own body was being poisoned. The human. Doctor had no advanced equipment, no database of alien biology, and no time to conduct proper research. But she had something that impressed even Dr. Nixara, who was watching from the observation ship. Cross had an absolute refusal to give up, even when facing impossible odds. Working with whatever medical supplies she could find, Cross began developing countermeasures in real time. She used stimulants to keep poisoned crew members conscious, painkillers to help them function through the agony, and improvised treatments that should not have worked, but somehow did. Her medical bay became a miracle factory where dying humans were given just enough strength to keep fighting. The countermeasures were only partially effective. Crew members throughout the human fleet were still dying from the Korthak toxins, but they were dying slowly instead of quickly. More importantly, they were staying conscious and functional long enough to continue the battle. What should have ended the fight in minutes only made the humans more determined. Lieutenant Commander. Sam Torres was coordinating the fleet's fighter squadrons while his nervous system was being destroyed by alien poison. His hands shook so badly that he could barely operate his controls, but his tactical decisions remained perfect. When Dr. Cross told him that he had maybe an hour to live, Torres simply nodded and continued his work. The psychological effect on the Korthak forces was devastating. They had used their most terrible weapon, and the humans were still fighting. Worse, the humans seemed to be drawing strength from their suffering. Crews that should have been dead were launching new attacks with a fury that shook even experienced Korthak warriors. Chief Engineer Ben Murphy had retaken most of his ship from the Korthak boarding party, but he was now fighting while suffering from the same biological weapons that were affecting the rest of the fleet. His vision was blurred and his breathing was labored, but he continued to hunt enemy soldiers through his vessel with tools turned into weapons. Dr. Nixara was recording psychological data that would revolutionize the study of sentient behavior. The humans were demonstrating that intelligence and determination could overcome biological limitations that should have been absolute. They were rewriting the rules of what was possible for organic life forms. Pilot Casey Williams was flying her damaged fighter through space while the Korthak toxins attacked her nervous system. Her controls were responding slowly because her reflexes were failing, but she compensated by predicting enemy movements and firing before they happened. She was fighting the future instead of the present, using her mind to overcome the limitations of her poisoned body. The human fleet was now operating on pure willpower. Most of the crew members should have been dead or unconscious, but they remained at their stations through sheer determination. Bridge officers like Navigation Chief Tony Blake were plotting intercept courses while their hands shook from nerve damage, but their calculations remained accurate. Zethkar realized that he was watching something that no galactic military academy had ever taught. The humans were not just fighting through pain and fear. They were fighting through their own deaths. They had accepted that they were going to die, and they had decided to make their deaths count for something. The Korthak fleet was now in full retreat mode, but the humans would not let them escape easily. Captain Morrison ordered his remaining ships to pursue the enemy vessels, even though his own crew was dying around him. The Liberty's bridge was filled with the smell of burned circuits and biological toxins, but Morrison continued to command his fleet with steady authority. When Communications Officer Rachel Stone collapsed at her station, another crew member immediately took her place. When that person fell unconscious, someone else stepped forward. The humans seemed to have an endless supply of people willing to die for their cause, and that terrified the Korthak more than any weapon could. Dr. Cross was now treating patients, while she herself was in the final stages of toxin poisoning. Her hands were steady despite the fact that her body was shutting down, and she continued to save lives even as her own life slipped away. She had developed treatments that were keeping half the fleet functional, and she was teaching other medical personnel how to continue her work. Lieutenant Kixtor was analyzing the human ships and realized that they were still capable of fighting, even in their current condition. The vessels were held together by emergency repairs and determination, but their weapons were still functional and their crews were still dangerous. The humans had somehow turned their own deaths into a tactical advantage. The Korthak commander was faced with a choice that no military leader should ever have to make. He could continue the battle and probably win, but at a cost that would cripple his fleet, or he could retreat and admit that his superior forces had been defeated by a handful of primitive humans who refused to die quietly. Zethkar watched as the human fleet prepared for what might be their final attack. The ships were damaged beyond repair, the crews were dying from alien toxins, and their supplies were nearly exhausted. But they were still moving forward, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. The battle had become something more than a military engagement. It had become a test of wills between two very different philosophies. The Korthak believed that superior force would always triumph. The humans believed that some things were worth dying for, and that death itself could be a weapon if used correctly. As the human ships closed in for their final assault, Zethkar knew that he was about to witness either the most heroic last stand in galactic history, or the most terrifying victory that any species had ever achieved. The final phase of the battle began with Captain Jake Morrison making a decision that would haunt Zethkar for the rest of his life. The Liberty was barely holding together, its hull cracked in dozens of places, and its crew dying from Korthak. toxins, but Morrison ordered his ship to ram the enemy flagship in a move that would certainly destroy both vessels. Morrison's voice came over the communication channels, weak but determined. His body was failing from the biological weapons, and radiation leaks from his damaged ship were slowly killing him. But his mind remained sharp and focused. When his communications officer, Rachel Stone, asked him why he would not consider surrender, his answer sent chills through the observation ship. Because if we surrender here, our children will have to fight this war instead. Better that we die today than they die tomorrow. Dr. Nick Sara was recording every word, every emotion, every psychological measurement from the human fleet. What? She was seeing violated everything she knew about intelligent behavior. Most species fought to preserve their own lives and the lives of their immediate community. But the humans were fighting for people who were not even born yet, for a future they would never see. The Liberty accelerated toward the Korthak command ship, its engines straining to provide thrust while the vessel fell apart around its crew. Chief Engineer Ben Murphy was in the engine room, manually controlling systems that should have been automated, working through pain that would have killed most sentient beings hours ago. Lieutenant Kickstor was analyzing the human ship's approach, and realized that Morrison was not just planning to ram the enemy vessel. The Liberty was positioned to take out 3 other Korthak ships in the explosion, maximizing the damage even as it guaranteed the death of everyone aboard. The humans were not just accepting their deaths. They were calculating how to make those deaths as meaningful as possible. On the medical deck, Dr. Helen Cross continued treating wounded crew members even though she was in the final stages of toxin poisoning. Her hands moved with practiced skill despite the fact that her nervous system was shutting down. She had saved dozens of lives during the battle, and she was determined to save a few more before her own life ended. The Korthak flagship tried to evade the Liberty's charge, but the human ship anticipated their movements. Navigation Chief Tony Blake was plotting the intercept course while suffering from radiation burns and biological poisoning, but his calculations were perfect. The Liberty stayed on target despite taking heavy fire from multiple enemy ships. In the final moments before impact, something impossible happened. Chief Weapons Officer Danny Park managed to restore partial power to the Liberty's main cannon. The massive gun had been damaged hours ago and should have been completely useless, but Park had been working on it throughout the battle, refusing to accept that it was beyond repair. The cannon fired once, sending a projectile the size of a small building directly into the Korthak flagship's command center. The enemy ship's shields collapsed, its command structure was destroyed, and its weapons went silent. The Liberty veered away at the last second, avoiding the collision that would have killed everyone aboard. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Over 60% of the human fleet had been destroyed, and most of the surviving ships were barely functional. The crews were exhausted, poisoned, and wounded, but they continued to fight with a determination that amazed and terrified their enemies. The Korthak fleet, demoralized by the loss of their command structure and horrified by human tenacity, began to retreat from the system. Their ships limped away into faster-than-light travel, leaving behind the wreckage of what should have been an easy victory. Zethkar watched as the surviving human ships regrouped around the Liberty. Medical teams moved between vessels, treating the wounded and dying. Engineering crews worked to repair critical systems. Communications officers coordinated rescue operations. Even in victory, the humans were focused on saving as many lives as possible. Captain Morrison was unconscious on his bridge, kept alive only by Dr. Cross's improvised treatments. The command of the fleet passed to his second officer, Lieutenant Commander Sam Torres, who was himself barely functional due to toxin poisoning. But Torres continued to coordinate the fleet's operations with the same steady professionalism that Morrison had shown. The human victory was unlike anything in galactic military history. They had not won through superior technology or tactical brilliance. They had won through an absolute refusal to surrender, a willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that most species considered abstract concepts. Dr. Nixara was struggling to write her psychological report. How could she explain to the Galactic Union that she had witnessed a species that fought more effectively when they were dying than when they were healthy? How could she describe beings who used their own mortality as a weapon against their enemies? The surviving human crews began the process of salvaging what they could from their destroyed ships. Engineer Katie Brooks worked to restore life support systems while bleeding from radiation poisoning. Pilot Chris Evans flew rescue missions in a fighter that was held together with emergency patches and determination. Medical officer Lisa Adams treated wounded crew members while she herself was suffering from the same biological weapons that had killed so many of her patients. The human medical staff had performed miracles during the battle, keeping people alive and functional through injuries and poisoning that should have been immediately fatal. Lieutenant Kixtor was analyzing the wreckage of the battle and making calculations that disturbed him. The humans had achieved a tactical victory that was mathematically impossible. They had used inferior ships and weapons to defeat a superior enemy through tactics that no military computer would ever recommend. But what truly frightened the observation team was the realization that this had not been exceptional human behavior. This was simply how humans fought when their backs were against the wall. They had not surprised themselves with their courage and determination. They had expected to fight this way from the beginning. The human fleet began its journey back to Earth, carrying their wounded and their dead, their damaged ships held together by emergency repairs and willpower. They had won their first major victory against an interstellar enemy, but they had paid a price that would be remembered forever. Zethkar knew that he had witnessed something that would change the galaxy. The humans had proven that they were more than just another primitive species. They were something new and dangerous, a people who fought not just to win, but to ensure that their enemies would never want to fight them again. The observation ship began its own journey back to Union space, carrying data and recordings that would revolutionize galactic understanding of warfare and psychology. But Zethkar wondered if some knowledge was too dangerous to share, and whether the galaxy was ready to learn what the humans had taught him about the true cost of victory. 3 months after the battle at Kepler 442, Zethkar sat in his office staring at a blank report that he could not bring himself to finish. He had written thousands of military observations over his career, but this one was different. This one would change everything the Galactic Union believed about warfare, about courage, and about what it meant to be intelligent life in a dangerous universe. The data was all there, recorded by the most advanced sensors the Union possessed. Video footage of human crews fighting while their ships fell apart around them. Audio recordings of Captain Morrison ordering his vessel to ram an enemy flagship while his own body was dying from alien toxins. Medical readings that showed humans functioning at peak efficiency while experiencing stress levels that should have killed them instantly. Dr. Nixara had submitted her psychological analysis weeks ago, but Zethkar could tell that even she was struggling to understand what they had witnessed. The humans had demonstrated behaviors that violated every theory about intelligent life that the Union had developed over thousands of years. Most species evolved to avoid danger and seek safety. They developed technology to protect themselves from the hostile universe and created societies that minimized risk to their members. War was something to be avoided if possible and ended as quickly as possible when it could not be avoided. But the humans seemed to embrace war as a natural part of existence. They did not fight to minimize casualties or preserve resources. They fought to make their enemies regret ever attacking them. They turned their own deaths into weapons and their suffering into strength. Lieutenant Kixtor had analyzed every piece of human technology used in the battle. Their ships were crude by galactic standards, their weapons were primitive, and their defensive systems were almost non-existent. But they had been designed by a species that expected to fight against superior enemies and had planned accordingly. Human vessels were built to keep fighting even after they should have been destroyed. Their crews were trained to operate under conditions that would incapacitate most sentient beings. Their tactics were based on the assumption that they would be outnumbered and outgunned, so they had learned to use those disadvantages as weapons. Zethkar had watched engineer Katie Brooks continue emergency repairs while suffering from radiation poisoning that should have killed her hours earlier. He had seen pilot Chris Evans fly suicide missions with the calm professionalism of routine patrol duty. He had recorded Medical Officer Lisa Adams treating wounded crew members while she herself was dying from the same biological weapons that had killed her patients. The humans had fought not because they were confident of victory, but because they refused to accept defeat. They knew they were fragile beings in a hostile universe, and they had decided to rage against that reality rather than submit to it. But what truly haunted Zethkar was the realization that the battle at Kepler 442 had not been exceptional human behavior. The recordings from their communications showed that they had expected to fight this way. They had trained for it, planned for it, and accepted it as the natural way their species responded to existential threats. The human fleet had returned to Earth with their wounded and their dead, their damaged ships held together by emergency, repairs, and determination. They had celebrated their victory, but they had also immediately begun preparing for the next battle. Because they knew, with the certainty of a species that had learned to expect conflict, that there would always be a next battle. Zethkar had requested a transfer to peaceful exploration duties after completing his observation mission. He told his superiors that he needed a change of assignment for personal reasons, but the truth was that he could not bear to watch another species die in battle. The humans had shown him what warfare really meant, and he never wanted to see it again. The Galactic Union's military advisors were already studying his preliminary reports and asking for more details. They wanted to understand how an inferior force had defeated the Korthak Empire using nothing but determination and improvised tactics. They wanted to incorporate human strategies into their own military doctrine, but Zethkar knew that they were missing the point. Human tactics could not be copied by other species because they were based on a fundamental acceptance of mortality that most intelligent life could not achieve. The humans fought the way they did because they knew they were going to die anyway, so they might as well make their deaths meaningful. Dr. Nixara had included a warning in her psychological report that Zethkar knew would be ignored. She had written that humans were not just another species that could be understood and categorized. They were something new in the galaxy, something that challenged every assumption about how intelligent life should behave. The humans did not fight to win in any conventional sense. They fought to ensure that their enemies would remember them, that future generations would be safe, and that their deaths would have meaning. They were willing to sacrifice everything for abstract concepts like freedom and justice, concepts that most species considered luxuries to be enjoyed during peacetime. Zethkar finally began typing his report, knowing that his words would be studied by military strategists and politicians throughout the Union. He wrote about human technology and tactics, about their psychological resilience and their tactical innovations. But he left out the most important truth he had learned. The humans were not dangerous because of their weapons or their ships or their strategies. They were dangerous because they had looked into the abyss of an uncaring universe and decided to fight back. They were dangerous because they refused to accept that they were small and weak and doomed to die. Years later, when other species spoke of human military prowess with a mixture of respect and terror, Zethkar never mentioned his role in documenting their first great victory. He had requested assignment to the furthest reaches of Union space, exploring empty star systems where he would never have to witness another battle. Sometimes late at night in his laboratory aboard a research vessel, Zethkar would remember the voice of Captain Morrison ordering his ship to ram the Korthak flagship. He would remember Dr. Cross treating wounded crew members while her own body was shutting down from alien toxins. He would remember the sound of human voices staying calm and professional while their world fell apart around them. The humans had taught him something that no other species in the galaxy understood. Death was not something to be feared and avoided. Death was something that could be faced with courage and used as a weapon against those who thought they were invincible. Zethkar had spent his life studying different forms of intelligent life, cataloging their behaviors and understanding their motivations. But the humans had shown him that intelligence was not just about solving problems or building technology. Intelligence was about choosing how to face the inevitable darkness that waited for all living things. The humans had chosen to face that darkness with defiance, and that choice had made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Zethkar knew that his report would eventually reach every government and military in Union space, and that the galaxy would never be the same again. He had been ordered to watch humans in battle, and now he regretted ever going. Some knowledge he had learned was too heavy to bear. Some truths were too dangerous to know, and some species were too frightening to understand, even when they were fighting on your side.